I'm Charmaine, 35 years old, and until last week I was the Senior Utility Compliance Specialist at Meridian Manufacturing for 12 years. I knew every regulation, permit, and protocol for keeping our facilities powered and operational. When the new management called my expertise dead weight, I walked out with my head high. 3 days later, their brand new $100 million plant went completely dark. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button to see how underestimating the quiet professional can turn out to be the most expensive mistake a company can make. Meridian Manufacturing had been my professional home since I graduated college. We weren't the biggest player in industrial production, but we were respected in the community and known for quality. Our headquarters sat just outside of Pittsburgh, with 3 smaller facilities scattered across Pennsylvania. The company had grown steadily over the years. Nothing flashy, just solid business practices and good relationships with customers and suppliers alike. I started as an administrative assistant in the operations department, but quickly showed an aptitude for the complex world of utility regulations. It might sound boring to most people, but I found it fascinating. The intricate dance between commercial power needs, regulatory compliance, and operational efficiency was like a complex puzzle that changed slightly every year as regulations evolved. By my 3rd year, I had created a comprehensive compliance tracking system that saved the company from several potential violations. By year 5, I had my own small team and reported directly to the operations director. The company recognized my value even if my role wasn't glamorous. I was the person who made sure the lights stayed on, the machines kept running, and no unexpected inspectors showed up with shutdown orders. Charmaine is our utility whisperer, our old CEO Richard Palmer used to say. She speaks regulations so the rest of us don't have to. Everything changed 18 months ago when Apex Industries acquired Meridian. Initially, the acquisition seemed like a positive development. Apex had resources and connections that could help Meridian grow beyond its regional footprint. The press release was full of promises about maintaining the culture that made Meridian successful while bringing world-class processes to accelerate growth. The first 3 months were exciting. Apex announced plans for a new state-of-the-art manufacturing plant that would be the most advanced facility in our industry. $100 million of investment right here in our hometown. 400 new jobs. A chance to produce innovative products that could compete globally. Everyone was buzzing with anticipation. Then the new management team arrived. Bradley Harrison swept into Meridian like he owned the place, which I suppose technically he did as the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer from Apex. He was everything our previous leadership wasn't. Loud, flashy, constantly talking about his previous wins at other companies. He wore custom suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary and made sure everyone knew about his vacation home in the Hamptons. "We're going to trim the fat at Meridian," he announced during his first all-hands meeting. "World-class companies run lean. Every dollar spent on overhead is a dollar not spent on growth." I didn't think much of it at first. Every new leader wants to make their mark, and talk of efficiency is pretty standard. But the atmosphere began to shift rapidly. Weekly management meetings became tense affairs where department heads were pitted against each other for resources. Longtime employees were labeled as set in their ways, while new hires from outside, often friends of Bradley, were brought in as change agents. The collaborative culture that had made Meridian special began to erode. People started protecting their territories, hoarding information, and avoiding responsibility for anything that might put them in Bradley's crosshairs. Meanwhile, the new plant project accelerated. Normally, a facility of that size would take at least 2 years of planning before breaking ground. Bradley pushed it through in 6 months. When our engineering team raised concerns about the rushed timeline, they were accused of not being bold enough and lacking vision. Several engineers quit in protest, only to be replaced by contractors who would sign off on whatever schedule Bradley demanded. I tried to stay focused on my area of expertise. The new plant would require complex utility interconnections, specialized permits, and careful coordination with the regional utility company. I prepared detailed briefings on the regulatory requirements and timelines, emphasizing that utility companies and regulatory agencies operate on their own schedules that can't simply be accelerated by throwing money at them. My first warning sign came when I was excluded from the planning meeting for the plant's utility infrastructure. When I asked why my new boss, A Bradley hire named Travis said, "We've got the engineering firm handling all that. Your input won't be necessary." I persisted, explaining that while engineers design the systems, someone needs to manage the relationships with the utility companies and navigate the regulatory landscape. "The engineers know what they're doing," Travis said dismissively. "Bradley wants us streamlining operations, not creating more bureaucracy." That evening, as I was working late, I overheard Bradley talking to our new CEO in the conference room next to my office. The door was slightly ajar, and Bradley's voice carried. "The compliance department is just dead weight," he said. "All they do is create paperwork and slow everything down. Once the new plant is operational, we should look at outsourcing most of that function." I froze at my desk, my stomach dropping. 12 years of dedication, and that's how he saw my contribution. Just dead weight. Despite the growing hostility toward my department, I remained determined to do my job professionally. The new plant wasn't just a building project. It represented the future of Meridian and the livelihoods of hundreds of families in our community. If it failed because of preventable compliance issues, everyone would suffer. I reached out to my contacts at Northeast Utility, the company that would provide power to the new facility. The plant would require a dedicated high-voltage connection due to its specialized equipment and energy demands. This wasn't a standard commercial hookup. It required special permits, equipment, and protocols that typically took months to process. "Charmaine, we haven't received any of the preliminary paperwork for the interconnection study yet," said Michael, my longtime contact at Northeast. "You know we can't even put this project in our queue until we get those forms." "What? The construction is already underway," I replied, confused. "The timeline shows power connection in 3 months." Michael laughed. 3 months. Even if you submitted everything today and it was perfect, which never happens, you'd be looking at 6 months minimum. More likely 8 to 10 months given the complexity of what you're describing. I thanked him and immediately drafted a detailed email to Travis, outlining the discrepancy and the urgent need to address it. I received no response for 3 days. When I finally cornered him in the hallway, he seemed annoyed. "The construction management company is handling all that. They assured Bradley everything is on schedule. But I just confirmed with Northeast Utility that they haven't even received our application." I persisted. "We need to get on this immediately, or the plant will be built with no way to power it." Travis sighed heavily. "I'll mention it to Bradley. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important meeting." The next week, I noticed that Jessica, a recent graduate who had joined my team 6 months earlier, was invited to the plant planning meeting while I was not. When she returned, she looked uncomfortable. "They asked me about the utility connection process," she admitted. "I told them what I knew. But Charmaine, I've only worked on small facility permits. This is way beyond my experience." "What did they say?" I asked. "Bradley said they needed fresh perspectives and that they'd handle the complicated stuff at the executive level." She couldn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to say no." The situation deteriorated from there. I discovered my department's budget had been slashed by 70% in the new fiscal year. My request for a specialized compliance tracking software was denied as unnecessary expenditure. My assistant Robert was reassigned to the marketing department without any discussion. Meanwhile, my workload shifted from strategic compliance management to mundane administrative tasks. I was asked to compile basic data that any intern could handle while critical compliance decisions were made without my input. I tried raising my concerns through proper channels. I documented potential violations and sent them to Travis, who either ignored them or replied with vague assurances that it's being handled. I requested meetings with the project management team, only to be told they were too busy, or that the schedule was already set. One afternoon, while retrieving a document from the shared project server, I accidentally opened a folder containing the construction timeline. Scanning through it, my heart raced when I saw that the utility connection was scheduled for completion 2 weeks before the final permits would even be reviewed by the Regulatory Commission. This wasn't just a miscommunication or oversight, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of how utility connections work. You can't just build a massive industrial facility and expect the power company to hook it up without the proper permits, inspections, and approvals. I printed the relevant pages and highlighted the discrepancies. This wasn't just about protecting my job anymore. This was about preventing a disaster that could cost the company millions and potentially endanger workers if proper safety protocols weren't followed. As I walked back to my office, I passed the break room where several executives were chatting. Bradley's voice carried into the hallway. "Once this plant is operational, the stock options are going to be worth a fortune," he was saying. "My bonus target is tied to bringing it in under budget and ahead of schedule." Everything suddenly made horrible sense. Bradley's aggressive timeline, the corners being cut, the dismissal of expertise. It was all about his personal payday. That night I stayed late compiling a comprehensive presentation. I included communications from Northeast utility regulatory requirements, historical examples of similar projects, and a clear outline of the risks we were facing. I would request a meeting with the executive team and present the facts professionally. Surely, when confronted with reality, they would have to take action. I refused to believe an entire company would knowingly march toward disaster just because one executive was too arrogant to listen. The next morning, I sent an email to Bradley's assistant, requesting a meeting with the executive team. I was careful to frame it constructively, emphasizing that I had important information that could help ensure the new plant's successful launch. Within an hour, to my surprise, I received a calendar invitation for that afternoon. I spent the rest of the morning refining my presentation, anticipating potential questions, and practicing my delivery. This wasn't about proving I was right or saving my job. It was about preventing a massive failure that would hurt the company and our community. At 2 o'clock, I walked into the executive conference room with my materials and a flash drive containing my presentation. The entire leadership team was there: Bradley, our CEO James Whitman, the CFO, the head of manufacturing, and several others I recognized from Apex. Travis sat in the corner looking uncomfortable. "Thank you for making time to see me." I began connecting my laptop to the projector. "I've identified some critical compliance issues with the new plant project that need immediate attention." Bradley immediately leaned forward. "Before you start, Charmaine, why don't you tell us exactly what your role is in the new plant project?" The question caught me off guard. "Well, as the senior utility compliance specialist, my role is to ensure all our facilities meet regulatory requirements and maintain proper relationships with utility providers. For the new plant, I should be coordinating the permitting process and working with Northeast Utility on the power connection." "Should be." Bradley raised an eyebrow. "But you haven't been assigned to the project team, have you?" "No, but that's part of what I wanted to discuss. There appears to be a gap in the compliance oversight that could create serious problems." I began my presentation showing the timeline discrepancies and explaining the utility connection process. I had barely gotten through the second slide when Bradley interrupted. "These are engineering concerns that our construction management firm is handling. They've built dozens of facilities like this." With all due respect, I continued, utility compliance isn't just an engineering issue. It's a regulatory and relationship issue. Northeast Utility has specific protocols that must be followed, and they operate on their own timeline that we can't control. I showed an email from my contact at Northeast, confirming they hadn't received our application. Without these approvals, the plant can't legally connect to the grid. The CEO, James, frowned. "How far behind are we on this process?" Before I could answer, Bradley jumped in. "We're not behind at all. The construction firm has assured me they're handling all the necessary permits." "But they can't," I insisted, pulling up the regulatory requirements. "The company itself must designate an authorized representative to file certain paperwork. It can't be delegated to contractors. And other applications require information only we have, like our historical usage data and corporate compliance records." I continued methodically through my presentation, showing the potential consequences of missing these requirements, the financial penalties, the delays that could stretch for months, the impact on production schedules and customer commitments. Some of the executives were beginning to look concerned, but Bradley became increasingly agitated. He interrupted repeatedly, questioning my expertise, suggesting I was exaggerating the risks, and insisting that his team had everything under control. When I explained the authorized representative requirement, Bradley scoffed loudly. "This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense I'm trying to eliminate," he said. "You're telling me we need a special person with a special title to fill out forms that any competent manager could handle." "It's not about the forms," I explained patiently. It's about who the utility company recognizes as authorized to make decisions during emergencies or special circumstances. They won't deal with just anyone, especially for a facility with this power requirement. And let me guess, Bradley said sarcastically, you're currently that authorized representative for our other facilities. Yes, for the past 7 years. Bradley exchanged a look with Travis, then turned back to me with a dismissive wave. This is exactly what I'm talking about. We've created these little kingdoms where certain people become indispensable for tasks that should be standardized and simplified. I felt my face flush but kept my composure. This isn't about making myself indispensable. It's about understanding that utility companies and regulatory agencies have their own requirements that we need to work within. Or Bradley leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. We could drag these archaic institutions into the 21st century by refusing to play their games. Northeast Utility wants our $100 million facility as a customer. They'll adapt to our timeline, not the other way around. I stared at him in disbelief. That wasn't how any of this worked. Utilities are regulated monopolies. They don't compete for customers. They don't bend their rules because someone demands it. Mr. Harrison, I said carefully, Northeast Utility is governed by state regulations. They literally cannot connect our facility without the proper permits and inspections. It's not a negotiating position, it's the law. Bradley's face hardened. You know what your problem is, Charmaine. You've been here too long. You've forgotten that rules can be broken, processes can be changed, and nothing is set in stone. He stood up and walked to the front of the room, effectively taking over my presentation. What we need at the New Meridian are people who solve problems, not people who create them. People who find ways to say yes, not people who list all the reasons to say no. He turned to face me directly, his expression cold. Essential implies leverage, and you, darling, have none. The room fell silent. I felt as though I'd been slapped. Several executives looked down at their notepads, unwilling to meet my eyes. Even James, the CEO, seemed uncomfortable but said nothing. I think we've heard enough, Bradley continued smoothly. Thank you for your concerns, Charmaine. We'll take them under advisement. As people began gathering their things, Bradley added casually, Oh, by the way, we're announcing a restructuring of the compliance department tomorrow. Travis will discuss the details with you after this meeting. And just like that, I was dismissed. 12 years of service reduced to an afterthought. Travis caught up with me in the hallway. Bradley asked me to set up a meeting with HR for you tomorrow morning, he said quietly. I'm being fired, aren't I? I asked, already knowing the answer. Travis couldn't meet my eyes. The compliance function is being reorganized. Your position specifically is being eliminated. They're calling it redundancy. The next morning, I sat across from a nervous HR representative named Melissa, who kept repeating phrases clearly crafted by legal. This is not a reflection of your performance. The company is moving in a new strategic direction. Your role has been identified as redundant in the new organizational structure. I was offered 2 weeks severance for each year of service standard outplacement services and the opportunity to apply for other open positions within the company. We both knew there were no positions I would be considered for. As I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, colleagues walked by with awkward smiles and whispered condolences, but no one stopped to talk. Word had spread quickly. I was now a cautionary tale of what happened to people who challenged Bradley Harrison. The shock of being fired hit me in waves. I would be fine one moment, rationally planning my next steps, and the next moment I'd find myself staring blankly at my living room wall, replaying Bradley's sneering words. Essential implies leverage, and you, darling, have none. After 12 years at one company, I barely remembered how to job search. My resume needed updating. My interview skills were rusty. And how exactly does one explain being suddenly terminated despite a perfect performance record? The weekend after I was fired, I fluctuated between anger and grief. Meridian hadn't just been my employer, it had been my professional identity. I knew every person, process, and problem. I had relationships with vendors, regulators, and utility partners that had taken years to build. All of that discarded because one arrogant executive couldn't be bothered to understand what I actually did. By Monday morning, I had regained some composure and direction. I would treat finding a new job as my full-time job. I updated my LinkedIn profile, reached out to industry contacts, and began researching companies that might value my specialized knowledge. I also had to decide whether to fight the termination. Pennsylvania is an at-will employment state, so technically they could fire me for any reason or no reason, as long as it wasn't discriminatory. But I had documentation of raising legitimate safety and compliance concerns just before being terminated that could potentially be seen as retaliation. After consulting with an employment attorney, I decided against pursuing legal action. The lawyer was honest. You probably have a case, but these things drag on for years, drain your finances and emotional energy, and often end in confidential settlements that don't really vindicate you. Instead, I would focus on moving forward. The best revenge would be success elsewhere. When I returned to Meridian on Wednesday to complete some paperwork, I discovered something alarming. No transition plan existed for my compliance responsibilities. I asked Travis who would be handling the utility interconnection issues for the new plant. The project management team will figure it out, he said vaguely. They won't know about the quarterly certification requirements or the emergency protocols, I pointed out. There are time-sensitive filings coming up. Travis looked uncomfortable. If you want to create some documentation before you leave, that would be helpful. I spent my last 2 days creating detailed process guides and checklists, knowing full well they would probably be filed away and forgotten. I included specific warnings about the new plant's connection issues, with a timeline of critical deadlines that were fast approaching. I sent everything to Travis, the project team, and several executives, including James, the CEO. Not one person acknowledged receipt. On Thursday afternoon, the company-wide email went out announcing the streamlining of administrative functions to enhance operational efficiency. Bradley was quoted praising the elimination of unnecessary bureaucracy and focusing resources on value-added activities. My 12 years of service were erased with corporate doublespeak. My final day was Friday. A small group of colleagues took me to lunch. The conversation was strained, with people carefully avoiding any mention of Bradley or the reorganization. These were friends I had worked with for years now, treating me like I had a contagious disease they were afraid to catch. After lunch, I finished packing my personal items, completed the exit interview with HR, and turned in my badge. As I walked through the lobby for the last time, I held my head high despite the hollowness in my chest. I wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me break down. That evening, as I was sorting through some work documents I had taken home over the years, I found something I had completely forgotten about. The authorized representative list for Northeast Utilities emergency protocols. It was a legally binding document that designated specific individuals who could authorize emergency services, approve urgent work, or implement contingency measures in case of utility issues. For all of Meridian's facilities, there was only one name on that list: mine. The designation required special paperwork, background checks, and training that I had completed years ago and updated annually. It wasn't something that could be quickly reassigned. Northeast Utility required advance notice and a formal process to change authorized representatives. I stared at the document, suddenly understanding a potential problem that hadn't occurred to me before. If there was any kind of utility emergency at any Meridian facility, including the new plant once it came online, Northeast Utility would only communicate with and take direction from me. And I no longer worked there. For a brief, vengeful moment, I considered doing nothing. Let them discover the oversight when it was too late. Let Bradley explain to the board why a critical compliance function was unnecessary bureaucracy. But the moment passed quickly. Too many innocent people would be affected if operations were disrupted. Former colleagues who had been kind to me. Community members whose livelihoods depended on those jobs. I drafted an email to Travis, explaining the situation and recommending immediate steps to designate a new authorized representative. My finger hovered over the send button. Then I remembered how my previous warnings had been ignored, how my expertise had been dismissed, how not a single executive had stood up for me when Bradley publicly humiliated me. They had made their choice. Now, they could live with the consequences. I closed my laptop without sending the email. It was no longer my problem to solve. I had a future to focus on. 3 days after my departure, Meridian Manufacturing was celebrating. The new plant, constructed in record time under Bradley's aggressive leadership, was ready for its grand unveiling. The company had invited local politicians, business leaders, and press to witness the ribbon-cutting ceremony for what Bradley had been calling the facility of the future. I knew about the event because it was all over the local news and my social media feed. Former colleagues shared excited posts about the new chapter for Meridian. The mayor gave interviews about the economic boost the plant would bring to our region. Bradley was quoted in the Business Journal taking full credit for bringing the project in under budget and ahead of schedule. No one mentioned the corners that had been cut or the compliance issues that remained unresolved. In the photos, Bradley stood front and center, scissors in hand, ready to cut the ceremonial ribbon. James, the CEO, stood beside him, beaming with pride at their accomplishment. According to the news reports, the plant would officially begin operations the next day, with the first production run scheduled for 9 a.m. Customers and suppliers had been invited to tour the facility and witness the state-of-the-art manufacturing process. I tried not to think about it. I had a job interview the next morning with a consulting firm that specialized in utility compliance. I needed to focus on my future, not Meridian's inevitable problems. But at 8:15 the next morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Travis's number. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, he called again. And again. After the fourth call, curiosity got the better of me. "Hello, Travis," I answered calmly. "Charmaine, thank God," he said, his voice tight with panic. "We have a situation. The plant has no power. None. Everything is down." Despite myself, I felt a twist of satisfaction. "That's unfortunate. Have you contacted Northeast Utility?" "We've been trying for over an hour. They're saying they can't discuss anything with us because we're not on some list. They keep asking for you." So there it was. Exactly what I had warned them about. "I don't work for Meridian anymore, Travis," I reminded him. "Remember dead weight that was eliminated for operational efficiency." "Charmaine, please." Travis's voice cracked. "There are 200 people standing around doing nothing. We have the press here. The mayor is asking questions. Bradley is losing his mind." "What does Bradley suggest?" "Perhaps he can drag Northeast Utility into the 21st century by refusing to play their games." I couldn't help throwing his words back at him. Travis didn't respond to the jab. "Can you just tell me what to do? How do we get the power turned on?" I sighed. As satisfying as it might be to leave them floundering, I wasn't cruel. "You need to file an emergency service request, but they'll only accept it from the authorized representative." "How do we change the authorized representative?" "Under normal circumstances, it takes about 30 days, I explained. For an emergency change, maybe 48 hours, if you have someone who already meets all the qualifications." Travis was silent for a moment. "We don't have 48 hours. We don't even have 48 minutes. The CEO just called an emergency board meeting. They're trying to understand how a $100 million facility can't even turn on the lights." I glanced at the clock. My interview was in 45 minutes. "I have to go, Travis. I have a job interview." "Please, Charmaine," he begged. "Just come in and help us sort this out. The company will compensate you, of course." I thought about it for a moment. "I'll consider it, but I need to make this interview first." I hung up and finished getting ready, pushing Meridian's crisis from my mind. I needed to focus on my future, not their emergency. The interview went well. The consulting firm was impressed with my expertise and experience. They mentioned they had several clients dealing with exactly the kind of compliance issues I specialized in. We discussed salary and benefits, and they suggested I might hear from them by the end of the week. As I walked to my car afterward, my phone buzzed with texts. 3 from Travis, 2 from my former assistant Robert, and surprisingly 1 from James, the CEO. All essentially communicating the same message: the situation was dire, the company was losing money by the minute, and they needed my help. I drove to a coffee shop to gather my thoughts. Part of me wanted to ignore them completely. Let Bradley face the consequences of his arrogance. Let the executives who sat silently during my humiliation scramble to fix the mess they allowed to happen. But another part of me, the professional who had dedicated 12 years to building something, couldn't just watch it burn. Not when hundreds of jobs were at stake. Not when the community I lived in would suffer from Meridian's failure. I ordered a latte and checked my email. There was a message from James with the subject line, "Urgent Consultation Opportunity." I opened it to find a formal offer for emergency consulting services at $500 per hour minimum, 8 hours, with immediate payment upon acceptance. At least they were taking it seriously now. I drove to Meridian, a strange feeling settling over me as I approached the building I had entered nearly every day for 12 years. The security guard recognized me and waved me through, clearly not having been updated on my employment status. The scene inside was chaotic. The main conference room had been turned into a crisis center, with executives, project managers, and engineers huddled in tense groups. A large screen displayed a countdown clock showing how long the plant had been offline next to a running tally of estimated financial losses. The number was already well over $200,000. Bradley stood at the front of the room, his face red as he shouted into a phone. "I don't care what your protocols say. We are losing a fortune here. Get somebody with authority on the phone right now." He slammed the phone down and turned freezing when he saw me. For a brief moment, something like relief flashed across his face before he composed himself. "So you've decided to help," he said, his tone somewhere between grateful and accusatory, as if I had caused the problem rather than predicted it. "I've been offered a consulting contract," I replied evenly. "I'm here to provide expertise, not to take orders or abuse." James hurried over before Bradley could respond. "Charmaine, thank you for coming. The situation is critical. The new plant has no power, and we can't get a straight answer from Northeast Utility. They keep talking about authorization lists and emergency protocols." I nodded. "I'm familiar with the issue." "Can you fix it?" James asked bluntly. "That depends," I replied. "Has anyone actually filed the interconnection applications and received the permits required for the high-voltage connection?" James looked at Bradley, who suddenly became very interested in his phone. "I thought so," I said. "Let me make a call." I stepped into a quiet corner and called Michael, my contact at Northeast Utility. "Charmaine, I was wondering when you'd call," he said. "There's quite a situation developing with your company." "Former company," I corrected him. "I'm here as a consultant." "What's the status?" Michael explained that the construction company had attempted to arrange a power connection without filing any of the required paperwork. When Northeast refused, Bradley had apparently escalated to increasingly higher levels of management, making threats and demands that only made the situation worse. "The bigger issue," Michael continued, "is that they tried to implement emergency backup protocols this morning when they realized they couldn't get the main connection approved quickly. But those protocols require authorization from the designated company representative." "Which is still me," I finished for him. "Exactly. We tried explaining that to them, but they insisted we deal with their project manager instead. We can't do that. It's not just policy, it's a regulatory requirement." I thanked Michael and returned to the conference room where the board of directors had now joined the crisis meeting. They sat at one end of the long table, grave expressions on their faces, as they listened to Bradley attempting to explain the situation. "It's a bureaucratic mix-up," he was saying. "The utility company is being unreasonable. They know exactly who we are." I cleared my throat. All eyes turned to me. "It's not a mix-up," I said clearly. "Northeast Utility is following required protocols. The plant cannot be connected to the grid without proper permits, which were never filed. And any emergency measures cannot be implemented without approval from the company's authorized representative." "So who is the authorized representative?" demanded one of the board members. A woman in a smart suit who I didn't recognize raised her hand. "I'm Catherine Bell, Northeast Utilities legal counsel. I can confirm that our records show only one authorized representative for all Meridian facilities." She looked directly at me. "She's the only one on the list." Every person in the room turned to stare at me. The CEO looked at Bradley with a dawning horror. "What list?" he asked quietly. The conference room erupted into chaos. Board members demanded explanations. Bradley tried to deflect blame toward the construction management company. Project managers insisted they had followed the scope of work provided to them. Everyone seemed to be talking over each other, pointing fingers and avoiding responsibility. Through it all, Catherine Bell, Northeast Utilities lawyer, stood calmly at the side of the room. When there was finally a break in the noise, she spoke with quiet authority. The Authorized Representative Program is a legal requirement for high-volume utility customers, especially those with critical infrastructure or specialized power needs. The representative undergoes specific training and certification to manage emergency protocols, special service requests, and regulatory compliance issues. This program exists for safety and security reasons and cannot be circumvented. She turned to me. Miss Montgomery has been Meridian's sole authorized representative for the past 7 years. All documentation, emergency protocols, and contingency plans list her as the point of contact. We cannot legally discuss certain matters or implement certain procedures without her authorization. James rubbed his temples. So what you're saying is that our former employee is the only person who can solve this crisis? That's correct, Catherine confirmed. Former employee that you terminated 3 days ago, added an older board member, glaring at Bradley, after she apparently tried to warn you about this very issue. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Suddenly, I was the most important person in the room. Bradley attempted to regain control of the situation. This is a simple fix. We'll just designate someone new right now. Catherine shook her head. It doesn't work that way. The process involves background checks, training certification, and regulatory review. Even on an accelerated emergency basis, it takes approximately 48 hours. 48 hours, the CFO exclaimed. We're losing over $10,000 per hour with the plant offline. That's nearly $500,000. James turned to me, his expression a mixture of humility and desperation. Charmaine, I understand you're here as a consultant. What would you recommend as our fastest path to resolution? I took a moment before answering. I wouldn't let my personal feelings about how I'd been treated affect my professional assessment, but I also wouldn't make this easy for them. There are 2 separate issues, I explained. First, the immediate power outage at the new plant. Second, the underlying compliance failures that led to this situation. Both need to be addressed. I outlined a plan. As the current authorized representative, I could implement emergency protocols to get temporary power to the facility. This would allow for basic operations while the proper permits and interconnection applications were filed. I would work with Northeast Utility to expedite the process as much as legally possible, while simultaneously training a qualified replacement to take over the authorized representative role. And what do you require to implement this plan? James asked carefully. My consulting contract expanded to cover the full resolution, not just today's emergency, $500 per hour with a guaranteed minimum of 40 hours, plus a letter of recommendation acknowledging my role in resolving this crisis, and a public correction to the announcement of my departure that clarifies I was not terminated for performance issues. Bradley started to object, but James cut him off. Done. Draw up the paperwork immediately. With the terms agreed upon, I went to work. I called Michael at Northeast Utility and initiated the emergency service protocol. As the authorized representative, I could approve temporary power connections that would get the plant minimally operational within hours, though at a higher rate than standard service. I also began the process of properly filing the interconnection application and permit requests that should have been submitted months ago. Michael agreed to expedite them as much as possible, but made no promises about timeline given the complexity of the project. Throughout the day, I conducted a thorough review of all utility compliance issues at the new plant. The situation was worse than I had feared. Not only were the power connections non-compliant, but water usage permits, waste management protocols, and environmental impact assessments were all either incomplete or missing entirely. By evening, temporary power had been restored to the plant, allowing for basic systems to function, though not at the capacity needed for full production. The board called another meeting to assess the situation. I presented my findings without sugarcoating anything. The plant cannot operate at full capacity for at least 30 days while proper permits are obtained. Even then, there may be modifications required to meet regulatory standards. The rush to complete construction led to numerous compliance oversights that must be addressed before the facility can be fully operational. The board members listened grimly. When I finished, the chairman asked me to wait outside while they discussed next steps privately. 20 minutes later, I was called back in. The board has conducted a preliminary review of the events leading to this crisis, the chairman announced. We find the oversight of critical compliance functions to be unacceptable. Effective immediately, Bradley Harrison is being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Bradley, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly found his voice. This is ridiculous. One minor oversight and you're throwing me under the bus. I delivered this plant under budget. Under budget because you cut corners that are now costing us millions, the chairman replied coldly. The board has lost confidence in your judgment. Please collect your things and leave the premises immediately. Security will escort you. As Bradley was led out, his face a mask of shock and rage, I felt no satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked closely with Meridian's team to address the compliance issues. I trained Robert, my former assistant, to take over as the authorized representative. I developed comprehensive compliance protocols for the new plant and created documentation that would prevent similar oversights in the future. The crisis had exposed deeper problems within the company. The aggressive cost-cutting and corner-cutting that Bradley had championed had created vulnerabilities throughout the organization. The board initiated a full review of operations with a particular focus on regulatory compliance and safety protocols. 3 weeks after the initial power outage, the plant received its proper permits and began ramping up to full production. The financial impact had been significant. Between lost production, emergency service fees, expedited permit costs, and my consulting fees, the company had lost over $4 million. The under-budget construction had ultimately cost far more than doing it properly would have. As my consulting contract neared its end, James called me into his office. He looked tired but relieved that the worst was behind them. The board has asked me to offer you your position back, he said. With a substantial raise and a direct reporting line to me, we recognize now how critical your function is to our operations. I had anticipated this offer and had given it considerable thought. I appreciate the offer, James, but I've decided to decline. He looked surprised. May I ask why? If it's about Bradley, he's gone for good. The board terminated him last week. It's not about Bradley specifically, I explained. It's about the culture that allowed someone like him to dismantle critical functions without oversight. It's about executives who stayed silent when they knew better. The problems at Meridian go deeper than one person. James nodded slowly. That's fair. What will you do next? I've decided to start my own compliance consulting firm, I told him. There are many companies facing the same issues Meridian did, often without realizing it until it's too late. I can help them avoid similar crises. Would your firm be interested in having Meridian as its first client? James asked. We clearly still need the expertise. We discussed terms for an ongoing consulting relationship that would allow me to build my business while continuing to support Meridian's compliance needs. It was a fair arrangement that recognized the value of my expertise without tying me to a company that had once discarded me. As I left James's office, I walked through the operations department, where I had spent so much of my career. Former colleagues greeted me with new respect in their eyes. The crisis had made visible what had previously been invisible. They now understood that compliance wasn't just paperwork and bureaucracy. It was the foundation that allowed everything else to function. Bradley had been wrong. Essential didn't imply leverage. Essential meant necessary, important, fundamental. You don't notice it when it's doing its job. You only notice when it's gone and everything falls apart. 6 months after the power crisis at Meridian, my compliance consulting firm, Montgomery Regulatory Solutions, was thriving. I had hired 3 associates and was looking to expand further. Meridian remained our anchor client, but word had spread quickly about how I had saved them from a prolonged and costly shutdown. Other companies in the region reached out, eager to avoid similar disasters. The experience had changed me in ways I never expected. Being fired after 12 years of dedicated service had initially felt like the worst thing that could happen to my career. In reality, it had freed me to recognize my true value and build something of my own. My new office overlooked the same industrial park where Meridian was located. Sometimes I would see the new plant from my window, now fully operational and compliant, and feel a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in the role I had played in saving it, lingering frustration at how I had been treated, but mostly gratitude for the push I needed to grow beyond the limitations of working for someone else. I had lunch occasionally with Robert, who had taken over many of my former responsibilities at Meridian. He told me that the company had undergone significant changes since the crisis. The aggressive growth targets had been tempered with more realistic timelines. Compliance considerations were now integrated into project planning from the beginning. The culture was slowly shifting back toward the collaborative environment it had once been. Bradley had not fared well after his termination. According to industry gossip, he had been trying to secure another executive position, but the story of the $100 million plant that couldn't turn on the lights had followed him. Companies were wary of his cost-cutting approach now that they had seen the potential consequences. One Friday afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Catherine Bell, the lawyer from Northeast Utility who had been present during the crisis, stopped by my office. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd see how your new venture is going," she said as we sat in my conference room. "It's going well," I told her. "Better than I expected, actually." She smiled. "I'm not surprised. What you did at Meridian was impressive. Not just the technical knowledge, but the way you handled the situation, professionally, despite how they had treated you. I appreciate that. Your clarity about the authorized representative requirements certainly helped shift the power dynamics in that room." Catherine laughed. "That was quite a meeting. I've been practicing utility law for 20 years, and I've never seen executives look quite that panicked." She paused. "But that's not why I stopped by. I have a proposition for you." She explained that Northeast Utility was creating a new customer advisory board focused on improving relationships with commercial and industrial clients. They wanted me to join as an inaugural member representing the perspective of compliance professionals. "Your experience bridges both sides," she said. "You understand the utility's regulatory obligations and the challenges businesses face in meeting them. That's a valuable perspective." I accepted the position, recognizing it as both an honor and an opportunity to shape policies that could prevent others from experiencing what Meridian had. As my business grew, I made it a point to mentor younger professionals, particularly women in the often male-dominated field of industrial compliance. I shared not just technical knowledge but lessons about workplace dynamics, recognizing your value, and having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Never let someone else define your worth, I would tell them. Expertise that prevents problems is just as valuable as expertise that solves them, even if it's less visible. Sometimes more valuable. I developed a reputation for straight talk and practical solutions. Companies hired me not just for technical compliance guidance, but for my ability to translate regulatory requirements into language executives could understand and appreciate. I helped them see compliance not as a cost center but as risk management that protected their investments. 1 year after the Meridian crisis, I was invited to speak at an industry conference about utility compliance for manufacturing facilities. As I prepared my presentation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. Being fired had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. It showed me who valued my contributions and who didn't. It forced me to advocate for myself in ways I never had before. Most importantly, it revealed that my expertise wasn't tied to my position at one company. It was something I carried with me, something I could build upon independently. When Bradley dismissed me as dead weight, he had inadvertently set me free. Free from undervaluation, free from invisibility, free to create something that truly reflected my worth. As I stood at the podium looking out at the audience of executives and compliance professionals, I began with a story. 1 year ago, a $100 million manufacturing plant sat dark and silent on its opening day. Not because of equipment failure or power outage, but because someone decided that compliance was just bureaucracy, that regulations were just suggestions, and that the people who understood both were dispensable. Today I want to talk about the hidden value of compliance expertise and how investing in it up front prevents costly crises down the road. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly in their seats. They had all heard about the Meridian disaster. Now they were hearing the inside story from the woman who had both predicted and solved it. I've learned that true expertise often goes unnoticed until it's absent. That standing up for professional standards sometimes means standing alone. And that knowing your value is more important than having others recognize it. Have you ever been underestimated in your workplace? Have you ever had your expertise dismissed only to be proven right later? Share your experience in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you handled it and what lessons you learned. Remember to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about workplace challenges and how to overcome them. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes being underestimated gives you the perfect opportunity to prove your true value.